The needle slipped and bit into Margaret's thumb for the third time that morning, and she barely flinched. Blood welled, small and dark, and she pressed it against her apron before it could fall on Helena's gown. "Don't you dare ruin this." Helena's voice cut through the doorway before her face even appeared. "Do you understand what tonight means? What this week means?" "I understand," Margaret said quietly, threading the needle again. "You don't. You can't. You've never had anything to lose." Helena swept into the room, already dressed for travel, diamonds at her throat that had once belonged to Margaret's mother. "Mother says you're to ride in the second carriage. With the trunks." "Of course. And you're not to speak unless spoken to. Not to the staff, not to the other families, and especially not," Helena's eyes narrowed, "not to the Duke." Margaret kept her eyes on the gown. "I wouldn't dream of it. See that you don't." Helena turned to leave, then paused. "Honestly, Margaret, 5 days at Ashworth Hall, and you'll be carrying trunks the entire time. Doesn't that humiliate you? Should it?" Something flickered across Helena's face, not quite anger, something closer to confusion, before she swept out without answering. Margaret finished the hem in silence. Her father's voice came to her, the way it always did in moments like this, steady and warm even after 6 years in the ground. Asterisk, a true lady isn't known by her jewels, Maid. She's known by what she does when no one's looking, asterisk. She tied off the thread and held the gown up to the light. Perfect. As always. The road to Ashworth Hall was long, and the second carriage rattled with every loose stone, trunks sliding and thudding against the walls. Margaret didn't mind. It gave her time to think and, more importantly, time alone. They stopped at a posting house near midday. While Cordelia and her daughters were ushered inside for tea, Margaret climbed down to stretch her legs and found a young maid pressed into the shadow of the stable wall, shaking, a broken serving tray scattered at her feet. "Are you hurt?" Margaret crouched beside her. The girl flinched. "I broke it, the innkeeper's wife. She'll take it from my wages, I can't." "Shoo. Here." Margaret gathered the shards quickly, wrapping them in her handkerchief. "Tell her it slipped from the shelf. The latch on that shelf looks loose anyway, see?" She tapped it, and it wobbled obligingly. "It's not a lie. It's just the part of the truth that helps." The girl stared at her. "Why would you?" "Because someone should," Margaret said simply, and pressed a few coins into her hand before anyone could see. "Go on. Before they miss you." She didn't notice the man standing near the stable door, dressed plainly but with a bearing that didn't quite match his clothes, watching the entire exchange with quiet, careful attention. Ashworth Hall rose out of the hills like something carved rather than built, gray stone, towering windows, ivy clinging to walls that had clearly decided, centuries ago, that they would not fall. Margaret craned her neck from the carriage window and for a moment forgot to breathe. "Close your mouth, Margaret. You look like a fishwife," Cordelia said without looking at her. Inside, the household staff moved with practiced efficiency, sorting guests from attendants with barely a glance. Margaret was shown to a narrow room near the servants' stair, small, plain, but clean, and given a list of duties as long as her arm. That evening, the formal welcome was held in the hall's great receiving room, all candlelight and hushed voices. Margaret stood near the wall with the other attendants, invisible as always, watching as Lord Julian Ashworth entered. He was younger than she'd expected, and colder, not cruel, but contained, like a door kept deliberately shut. He greeted Cordelia and her daughters with exact, measured courtesy. Helena curtsied, so low it bordered on theatrical. Rosalind giggled nervously. His eyes passed over Margaret. And stopped. It was less than a second. A glance, nothing more, but something in it landed differently than any glance had landed on her in years. Not pity. Not dismissal. Something closer to notice. Then he moved on, and the moment was gone, and Margaret told herself she'd imagined it. Dinner that night was a performance disguised as a meal, every word measured, every laugh calculated for effect. Margaret stood near the sideboard with the other attendants, ready to refill glasses, when a young serving girl, the same one from the posting house, she realized with a start, stumbled and sent a full glass of wine across the front of Rosalind's gown. The room went silent. "You stupid girl," Rosalind shot to her feet, face white with fury. "Do you have any idea what this gown cost?" "It's only wine, Rosalind. Sit down," Helena hissed, though her tone carried more contempt for the maid than concern for her sister. "She'll pay for it. Out of her wages, for a year." "She will do nothing of the sort." Lord Julian's voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The entire table turned. The girl tripped on a carpet that has needed replacing for 3 months, a fault of this house, not hers. His gaze swept the table, calm and unyielding. "If anyone here believes a torn gown is worth more than a person's dignity, I'd ask them to reconsider whether they understand what they're here to be considered for." Silence. Rosalind sat down slowly, color draining from her face. Helena's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Margaret, frozen by the sideboard, watched the maid's hands shake as she gathered the broken glass and quietly, when no one else moved, knelt down to help her. She didn't see Lord Julian watching from across the room, but he saw her. Later, in the corridor outside the servants' stair, Margaret found the same girl still trembling, pressed against the wall. "You're all right," Margaret said softly, crouching beside her. "It's done. No one blames you." "He defended me," the girl whispered. "A duke. Defended me." "Some people," Margaret said, "are exactly as kind as they can afford to be. It's rare to meet one who's kind beyond that." The girl managed a small, shaky laugh, and Margaret stayed with her until the shaking stopped. It was nearly an hour later that Margaret, lost and turned around in the unfamiliar halls, pushed open a door expecting a linen closet, and found instead the largest room she had ever seen. Floor to ceiling, every wall was books. Thousands of them. The smell of leather and old paper hit her like a wave, and she stepped inside before she could stop herself, turning slowly, mouth slightly open. "You're not supposed to be in here." Margaret spun around. Lord Julian stood near the far shelves, a book in his hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm sorry, I was lost, I didn't mean." "I didn't say leave." He set the book down. "I said you're not supposed to be in here. There's a difference." Margaret hesitated, caught between the door and the shelves. "Do you read?" he asked. "My father taught me to. Estate records, mostly, accounts, tenant ledgers, crop rotations." He said a person who manages a household should understand it the way they'd understand their own hands. Something shifted in Julian's expression, surprise, and something quieter beneath it. "That's a rare thing to teach a daughter." He was a rare sort of father, Margaret said, and for the first time all day, she smiled. Neither of them noticed how long they stood there, talking about books, about land, about the things that mattered beneath the surface of things. It was only when the candles burned low that Margaret realized how late it had grown, and excused herself, flushed and lighter than she'd felt in years. She didn't see Helena watching from the corridor as she left, face tight, eyes narrowed, already calculating. The next morning brought the tenant presentation rows of ledgers, complaints about failed harvests, a leaking roof, wages owed. Helena answered each question with practiced charm and no substance. Rosalind barely answered at all. Margaret, standing at the back with the other attendants, scanned the open ledger on the table out of old habit and stopped. The flood damage figure was wrong. Badly wrong. Off by enough to make the estate's losses look far worse than they were. "Is something the matter?" Margaret looked up. Lord Julian was watching her directly, across the entire room, in front of everyone. My lord, it's not my place. I'm asking you to make it your place. What do you see? Every eye in the room turned to her. Helena's face went rigid. Margaret stepped forward, throat tight, and pointed to the line. The flood losses are calculated against last year's full yield, but the lower fields were already fallow that season for replanting. The real loss is less than half what's recorded here. If this figure stands, the estate will be compensating for damage that didn't happen. Silence. Then Julian nodded slowly. She's right. The room erupted into murmurs. Helena's hands clenched in her lap. And Margaret, for the first time in 6 years, felt every eye in a room and didn't look away. Lady Cordelia found Margaret that afternoon, alone in the corridor outside the linen room, and her smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes. That was quite a display, she said. I only said what was true. Of course you did. Cordelia stepped closer, voice dropping low. But let me be clear, Margaret, because I'd hate for you to misunderstand. A man like Lord Ashworth doesn't notice girls like you. Not really. What you saw today, that was curiosity. A novelty. Nothing more. Don't mistake a moment's amusement for something it isn't, or you'll only humiliate yourself further. Margaret said nothing. She'd heard versions of this warning her whole life. Know your place. Don't hope for more. Don't be foolish, and she'd learned long ago that arguing only made it worse. But something in her chest didn't believe it this time. Not entirely. Cordelia studied her face, and whatever she saw there made her smile thin further. Just remember who you are, dear. She swept away, leaving the words hanging in the air like smoke. That evening, Margaret was summoned to the steward's office and found, to her shock, an entirely different room waiting for her. Larger. Warmer. A proper bed, a writing desk, a window overlooking the gardens. There's been a mistake, she said immediately. I'm an attendant, I shouldn't. No mistake, the steward said, not unkindly. Lord Ashworth's instruction. You're a guest in this house, Miss Holloway. You'll be treated as one. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway long after he'd gone. She couldn't know, that in another part of the house, Julian sat with a ledger of a different kind spread across his desk. The Holloway estate accounts, quietly requested days ago. The funds set aside for Margaret's care. Her dowry. All of it, steadily drained over 6 years into Cordelia's household expenses, her daughter's gowns, her carriages. Julian closed the ledger slowly, jaw tight. So that's the shape of it, he thought. In a guest sitting room 2 floors below, Helena paced while Rosalind sat curled in a chair, picking at her sleeve. He moved her, Helena said, for the 4th time. He moved her. To a guest room. Do you understand what that means? Maybe it doesn't mean anything. It means everything, Rosalind. Helena's voice cracked sharp through the room. He's looking for something. I don't know what, some quality, some nonsense, and somehow she's the one who keeps falling into his line of sight. The servant. The attendant. What do you want to do? Helena's eyes were hard, calculating. I want her gone. Quietly. Before the final ball. Before he decides he's seen enough. The days before the final ball passed in a blur of fittings and frantic preparation. Margaret dressed Helena and Rosalind each morning with the same careful precision she always had, though now, when she returned to her own room at night, she changed into her mother's old ivory gown, soft with age, carefully preserved for 6 years. It wasn't fine. It wasn't fashionable. But it was hers, in a way nothing else in her life had been. The ballroom that final night blazed with candlelight, every family dressed in their finest, every conversation a quiet performance. Margaret stayed near the edges, as always, until a trembling young woman, Charlotte, stumbled into her near the refreshment table. I can't do this, Charlotte whispered. Everyone here is so certain, and I feel like I'm going to be sick. You won't be sick, Margaret said gently, steering her to a quieter corner. You'll breathe in slow there. Again. You don't have to be certain. You just have to be honest. That's enough. Charlotte's breathing steadied, and she looked at Margaret with something like wonder. How do you do that? Margaret smiled faintly. Practice. Later, Julian found her near the library doors, a flimsy excuse about retrieving a book, though they both seemed to know it was only that, an excuse. I've been watching you, he said quietly, once they were alone. Not tonight. All week. Margaret's heart stilled. My lord. The maid in the corridor. The ledger. The girl just now, by the refreshments, I saw that too. He stepped closer, voice low and steady. Everyone in that ballroom is performing for an audience. You've spent this entire week doing the opposite. Being decent when no one was watching at all. It's only, Margaret's throat tightened. It's only what my father taught me. Then your father taught you something most people never learn. Julian's gaze held hers, something unguarded in it for the first time. That matters more to me than anything happening in that ballroom tonight. For one long moment, neither of them moved. Then a commotion erupted behind them, raised voices, a gasp rippling through the crowd, and Julian's expression shifted instantly, the warmth replaced by something sharper. Stay here, he said, and strode toward the noise. Margaret followed anyway. In the center of the ballroom, Helena stood holding a small ivory card aloft, her voice pitched to carry across the entire room. In the center of the ballroom, Helena stood holding a small ivory card aloft, her voice pitched to carry across the entire room. I found this in her room, Helena announced, eyes locking onto Margaret as she emerged from the crowd. A bride selection invitation, written in her own hand. She's been pretending to be a candidate this entire time, deceiving everyone. That's not mine, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her face. I've never written such a thing in my life. Of course you'd say that. Rosalind's voice, sharp and triumphant. A servant, trying to climb above her station. It's pathetic. I am exactly what I have always been, Margaret said, louder now, the entire room's eyes on her. An attendant in this household. Nothing more was ever offered to me, and nothing more was ever claimed. Liar, Helena hissed and lunged forward, grabbing the shoulder of Margaret's gown. The fabric tore a long ugly rip down the seam, and a collective gasp went through the crowd. Margaret stood frozen, the torn ivory fabric hanging from her shoulder, her mother's gown, the only thing of her own she had left ruined in front of 200 witnesses. The room went utterly silent. And then Julian moved. He crossed the floor in long, deliberate strides, removed the heavy velvet cloak from his own shoulders, and settled it gently around Margaret's, covering the torn gown, covering her, in front of everyone. Enough, he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room had already gone completely still. He turned to Helena, to Rosalind, to Cordelia standing pale and rigid near the wall. I have spent this week looking for a woman capable of carrying the responsibility this house demands. Tonight, in front of every family invited here, I have watched two of you destroy a young woman's dignity in public over a card you yourselves planted. My lord, Cordelia started. Mr. Eldon, Julian said, without looking away from Margaret, would you bring forward what you found? A quiet, composed older man stepped forward from near the doors, the same man, Margaret realized with a jolt, from the posting house days ago, holding a second card and a sheet of handwriting samples. The invitation is a forgery, my lord, Eldon said clearly. The hand doesn't match Miss Holloway's. It matches Miss Helena's correspondence, submitted with her own application this week. Helena's face went the color of ash. Lady Cordelia, your daughters, and you will have no further contact with Miss Holloway, Julian said, voice cold and final. Your party is excused from this selection, effective immediately. And I will be conducting a full review of the Holloway family finances, a review I expect will be illuminating. Cordelia opened her mouth, found nothing to say, and closed it again. Julian turned back to Margaret, and his expression softened completely, the cold authority gone, replaced by something gentler. "Come," he said quietly. "Let's get you somewhere quiet." Asterisk if this moment gave you chills. Smash that like button and comment below if you think Margaret deserves everything that's coming to her. We're just getting started.